Well, my name is Shanna Steitz, and I'm here to recruit you. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our fourth resurrection revolutionary, Harvey Milk, that was his signature line. At neighborhood meetings that became campaign rallies that became pride events, Harvey Milk was, as Suzanne said, one of the first openly gay elected officials in America and the first in California when he was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in November of 1977. Now, I know we have a bunch of people who have actually lived in San Francisco in the 60s and 70s. I think most of them were at 830, which really made 830 interesting this morning, I just have to say. The City Board of Supervisors is sort of like the City Council, for those of you who don't know, but almost from the very moment Harvey moved to San Francisco in 1972, he began recruiting folks into the beloved community that he and others were creating in the Castro district in San Francisco. A community of people where everyone was safe to be themselves, even in a neighborhood that sometimes wasn't always the safest. They committed themselves to one another. A place full of outcasts from all over the world. People were coming from all over the world to the Castro. And when Harvey Milk first announced his first candidacy for political office, he ran like 4 times before he actually won. He stood up in the middle of the street because their neighborhood had a pretty severe run-in with some police brutality a few days before, and he stood up in the middle of his neighborhood and said, "My fellow degenerates." He said that, of course, as only he could, because these were his people. He knew them well. In the movie Milk, Harvey is seen as recording his story in case he gets killed. And then he describes those early days in the Castro by saying, people just started hanging out around our store, young people looking for a home away from home. One of our church members, also ordained clergy, Kathy Sylvie. Kathy was at the 8:30 service this morning. She sent me an email this week knowing Harvey Milk was coming up as our next revolutionary, and she said, "Shanna, I moved into one of the adjacent neighborhoods to the Castro in 1975, and one of the very first things that one of my friends did was take me to the Castro, point out Harvey Milk's shop, and say, right there, if you ever need anything, they will help you, or at least they'll try. And no matter what is happening, you are safe there." Even as a white, straight woman, Kathy describes how that felt to her. It seemed that Harvey Milk's camera shop was becoming beloved community, and I can't help but think, as I have read about it and heard about it over the years, as I hear people who were there who described it, I often think, wow, that sounds like what church is supposed to be. A place where people who have been tossed aside by the rest of society could come and feel safe. You know, that sounds a whole lot like one of our earlier resurrection revolutionaries. The very first one, actually. The very first revolutionary was Jesus of Nazareth, of course, and Jesus was constantly in trouble for hanging out with outcasts and folks that the dominant culture said, oh, they're unclean. Oh, Jesus, those people are inappropriate. Oh, Jesus, don't hang out too much with those people, Jesus. And Jesus brings them into his Jesus circle, some of them only for a minute, and he tells them, some of them for the first time in their life, that they have a place in the family of God, that they were not degenerates. And for many of those folks, it was life-changing for them. This Jesus person's unconditional welcome and acceptance, telling everyone that they were not outcasts, but that they were loved and beloved. It's hard for me to get my head around as a white, straight woman what it must be like to not feel loved and beloved in church. It's really hard for me to get my head around because church has always been my safe place. It has always been a place for me where I knew I was loved and welcomed, even in my little teeny tiny country Methodist church. And so it's hard for me to know what that must feel like. Suzanne and I had one of our besties in seminary who was not able to be ordained at the same time as we were. Took 10 years. And we came from all over the world to West Texas, y'all. To be present and to be witness and to plant our feet there to be with him. And even the old football coach of my daddy said to this dear friend of ours, I don't understand. Suzanne got, Ryan and Shanna went to Midland for Suzanne's ordination, and some of y'all went to Denver for somebody else. He says, I don't understand why you're not getting ordained today. And this particular person says, Coach Files, I'm gay. And my daddy says, yeah, I don't understand, so I don't get it. If even the old football coach can get it. Just saying. So I knew in a whole different way, from a pastoral way, through our 4 years in serving a church in Southern California. Our second year there, we became the home for the Gay Men's Chorus of Los Angeles, and they met in our space, and they had concerts in our space, and we came to know many of the more than 250 of the most gorgeous, y'all know I love a bass voice, and Lord of mercy. And I heard from being, some of them, the only pastor that they knew, the horrible stories of how they ended up in Southern California and having been tossed out by families and communities and churches, many of them like the tiny little wide spot in the road country places like I grew up. And it was really hard to hear their stories, and to hear how they had ended up, many of them, in the chorus because they knew they were welcomed and loved and beloved, and they'd found a family there, and they'd found a home there. And I said time and again when they would tell me what they had found in the chorus, I couldn't help but think, yes, that's what the church is supposed to be when we are at our very best. And this has become so important to me because so many of the people that I have had the privilege of them sharing their stories with me. I may not get quite as fired up as I did last week, but sometimes I can get close. I got this letter one day in my office. It was addressed to the entire clergy staff. It was from a man who had been visiting us An older gentleman, could have been anybody's little Midwest grandfather, his khaki pants and his blue blazer and his sweater vest, even in the summer in Los Angeles, and his penny loafers, and he was quiet and simple and unassuming. And he sent this letter, and I was reading it at my desk in my office one day, and then I got to a line that I will never forget. And he said, I'm more than 70 years old, and I have waited my entire life to find a place where I know that I am welcome and loved and beloved by God. He said, the only thing that I regret is that his life partner of almost 50 years had died only a couple of years earlier in his sleep. And he did not get to know this gift that this little man had found. And I sat in my office. I literally sat on the floor and I wept. From the depths of my soul, I wept. And in that moment, I made a promise to myself that never should anyone have to wait more than 70 years to know that they are loved and beloved children of God. And when we raise up littles, to know that God loves them, period. When we put a period behind that, not a comma, not a semicolon, not a anything else, not a but or a yet or a maybe. When we put a period behind that, that changes how kids grow up in a church where they know that they are loved and beloved children of God. That letter changed my life. It changed my ministry. And y'all, the church has struggled with this issue for so long. And churches and denominations are tearing themselves apart over it. And maybe I'm just a small town girl from a wide spot in the road, and I'm very simple-minded, but it doesn't feel that complicated to me. Jesus' message was pretty simple. And Jesus always put people first. And the stories that for many of us are most beloved in the Gospels are stories where Jesus just loves people. And there's no big fancy theological words. He just talks and lives a life of loving people. And he brings together all the people on the margins. That's Jesus' work. And that's why after Jesus' death, people rallied to keep his message alive because they had been changed. Because this Jesus person loved them and welcomed them and gave them a place, a safe place, a place of hope. Harvey Milk talks about all the us's that are on Reverend Suzanne. And I have on the same shirt. You just can't see it under my robe this morning. Harvey talks about all the us's and bringing all the us's of the world together. Because Harvey was working for all of the outcasts. In his 1970s language, he, talks about the us's, including the blacks and the Hispanics and the seniors and the handicapped. Again, his 1970s language. And he said in one of his recordings that in the event of an assassination that thousands might rise up to keep the movement alive because it's not about one person. He said, quote, "It's about giving people hope That's what this is about. Not about personal gain or ego or power. It's about hope for a better world. It's about hope for a better tomorrow, hope for a better place to come if the pressures get too great, hope that it will all be okay. He says you got to give them hope. Because without hope, the us's will give up. And you can't live on hope alone, Harvey said, but without it, life is not worth living. And so you got to give them hope. That's what Harvey Milk said. And it seems like I should really have some smart theological thing to say this morning. But it seems to me that hope is what resurrection is really all about. And it seems to me that Harvey Milk's work is a pretty good job description for any clergy person, giving people hope and creating a safe place for all God's children that they might know that they are loved and beloved, and I really don't think that's all that hard. I saw hope with hands one day from a member of this church, and I was never more proud to be somebody's pastor than the day that Mars Ireland stood up at an event, an interfaith event that I happened to be at. We weren't together. We weren't sitting together. And it is, as we have said throughout this worship series about wherever Ryan's planting his loafers or I'm planting my stilettos or with whom I'm planting my stilettos. And it was about with whom do we stand and where do we stand. And Mars stood. I have her permission to tell this story. Mars stood. And she said, I stand to give a hug to every gay kid whose mother no longer is there to hug them. I was never more proud to be somebody's pastor than that day, Mars Ireland. You got to give them hope. And 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 if that means it's a tangible hope with hands, hugging somebody who needs a hug, we got to give them hope. All the S's. Because I'll be damned if anybody in this church or that comes through these doors needs to wait 70 years to know that they are loved and beloved. I will not allow anyone to wait 70 years to hear a message of hope and love and inclusion. And so my name is Shanna Steitz, and I'm here to recruit you. May we give them hope. May it be so. Amen.